There is something in your blood that may be more primitive than any civilization you have ever studied. Older than Sumer, older than Egypt, older than any record that official history has bothered to register. And the strangest thing is not its antiquity, but that very specific forces, over thousands of years, worked so that you would never know it. We are not dealing with a conspiracy theory circulating on internet forums. It is something that appears in Gnostic texts, in Sumerian traditions, in the practices of royal lineages that cross continents and centuries. It is a pattern that repeats itself with a terrifyingly disturbing constancy and points in a single direction. Certain human genetic configurations are a direct threat to control systems that are much older than any modern government or institution. And in the midst of all this, there is a question that conventional science is still far from answering satisfactorily. Where did Rh-negative blood come from? Before continuing, if you were drawn to this video, you probably already feel that there is something much bigger in this world than what we are allowed to see. Like this video, turn on notifications and share it with someone who also questions things, because the content we are going to delve into here is exactly the kind that quietly disappears from social media. Let's start with the scientific fact that no one can really explain why. About 85% of human beings have the protein known as the Rh factor, rhesus factor, in their blood, the well-known Rh positive. This protein can be traced evolutionarily back to primates. There is a biological logic, of course, for this to exist. But the other 15% of the world's population that has Rh-negative blood, these people simply do not possess this protein. And when scientists try to trace its evolutionary origin, they encounter a void, a biological silence that should not exist. This in itself is interesting. But what really makes the scenario so compelling is what happens when a mother with Rh-negative blood is pregnant with an R-positive baby. If the egg is fertilized by sperm with incompatible blood, something transforms. Her body begins to see it as a threat instead of protecting the child. The maternal immune system generates antibodies against her own child. This is not a minor anomaly. It is a mother's body biologically fighting against her own child. And this only happens when there is such a profound incompatibility that it leads many alternative researchers to the existence of two genetically distinct lineages trying to merge in the same body. Traditional science calls this Rh incompatibility and has some practical medical solutions, but it does not explain the origin. It does not say where that difference came from, and it is in that very silence where ancient traditions begin to speak. Sumerian texts, which represent one of humanity's oldest written records, speak of beings called the Anunnaki, who allegedly carried out genetic interference in the human species, according to these texts. It does not matter how you interpret this story, as a literal history, as a symbolic metaphor, or as encoded ancestral memory. What is impossible to ignore is the consistency with which this idea appears in cultures that are geographically and temporally completely separated. The Gnostics, centuries later and on another continent, spoke of entities they called Archons, creatures that live in a dimension parallel to our physical reality and feed on specific human emotional states: fear, anger, despair, chronic anxiety. And the Gnostics were not far off when speaking of the operations of these entities, not through force, but through the distortion of perception. They didn't need to make you go anywhere. They just had to make sure you never questioned anything you were experiencing. And here is the point that connects the Sumerian text with Gnostic teachings. For in both traditions, it is taught that not all humans were equally modified by this invasion. Some lineages maintain something, a genetic residue, a biological frequency, a configuration that was not entirely overwritten by the control protocol. Rh-negative blood, specifically type O negative, is repeatedly linked to this intersection. You might be wondering what exactly it is about that blood that makes it a target for the Archons. If they are entities that supposedly operate in dimensions beyond our physical reality, why would they care about a protein missing in the blood of a minority of the human population? The answer lies in how the Archons capture human consciousness. They need a gateway, and this access point is emotional and energetic. They connect to the low vibration states we maintain when we are in constant survival mode, when we operate from fear, anger, shame, and despair. People with Rh-negative blood report an impossible-to-ignore frequency of traits that make it quite difficult to stay in that low vibration state. They report an almost instinctive resistance to propaganda, an ability to sense when they are being manipulated even before they can rationally explain why, an intuition that works like an internal warning system that goes off before the conscious mind has time to process the threat. They also report a constant feeling of not belonging anywhere, as if they were foreigners in a world that seems designed for people who move differently, designed to consist of certain things that most people around them accept without blinking. This is not vanity, it is a different frequency. We know that every code operates based on a pair of encryption and decryption keys. Different codes mean different keys. It hurts to remember that the ruling classes have lived beyond the reach of all political and economic justification throughout history. Among the royal families of Europe, genealogical records were kept with almost obsessive rigor. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt intermarried with a frequency that modern science would consider unsustainable. The priestly castes of Babylon considered their genealogical records their greatest treasure. Why? If power came down only to land, wealth, and armies, why this obsession with the blood of the ruler in question? The answer given by esoteric traditions is simple. They were aware that certain genetic combinations resulted in human beings who, in essence, would be harder to control, harder to corrupt, more predisposed to awaken to the true nature of the reality around them. And in a system based on the perpetuation of collective illusions, this type of person represents the worst of all dangers. Not because they are violent or revolutionary in the conventional sense, but because they simply refuse to believe the lies that keep the system running. And when a man stops believing in a lie, he stops giving it energy. And when enough people stop feeding an illusion, that illusion collapses. There is a part of this knowledge that ancient traditions understood with a depth that modern science is only just beginning to reach. Blood is not just a biological transport fluid, it is an information carrier. In ancient cultures, from Siberian shamanism to the Hermetic traditions of the Mediterranean, blood was seen as the link between the physical body and what we might call the soul or non-local consciousness. When you remove certain proteins from the equation, proteins that, from some points of view, were added through genetic engineering process to make humans more docile, more controllable, more disconnected from their original spiritual capacities, you are essentially preserving an ancient blueprint, a type of human that still keeps channels open for frequencies that the control system wishes had been blocked forever. This contextualizes something that history recorded as primitive barbarism, the blood sacrifice cults of ancient cultures. When you understand that blood carries spiritual and energetic information, and that some lineages possess stronger versions of that information, sacrifice rituals become less a practice of tribal violence and more a way to absorb and nullify the spiritual energy associated with specific lineages. The entities that consummated these rituals were not just consuming fear and death, they were absorbing something of much higher value. Well, now to the present, because what is happening today is an updated version of the same model. The worldwide race to catalog human DNA through genetic genealogy companies, government databases, and public health programs is portrayed as a benevolent advancement of science. Sure, there are legitimate medical uses in this process, but when you understand the broader picture we are discussing, you see another layer of meaning. You can identify at the genomic level exactly who those individuals are that carry the markers making them naturally resistant to the control system, and therefore they can be monitored. You can track them. You can, if necessary, intervene before they become fuses for an even greater awakening. And transhumanism, blending human biology with technology, gene editing, inserting synthetic DNA into living organisms, must be seen in this context as well. If you can edit the human genome, you can possibly eliminate the genetic markers that provide natural resistance against control. You can manufacture a uniformly malleable humanity, uniformly tuned to the frequencies the system needs to function. This is not science fiction. The tools to do this already exist. The question is, where are they being aimed? And this is where the narrative takes a turn that many people do not expect. And this is the most important part of everything we are talking about. The Rh factor alone determines absolutely nothing. A person's blood type, living in a world that now basically never wakes up, without questioning anything, taking unfiltered whatever the system produces, is just as susceptible to manipulation as any other. The genetic marker creates a predisposition, a natural tendency, a path of least resistance for awakening, but it does not create the awakening automatically. And in the opposite direction, anyone of any blood type, of any lineage, of any genetic origin, who consciously makes the decision to do the work of awakening, who commits to raising their frequency, to questioning the narratives they have consumed, to expanding their intuition and their connection with deeper levels of reality, can develop the same immunity to archontic manipulation. Because consciousness is what counts. It always has been. Blood type is like being born with a radio already tuned to a specific frequency. But anyone can learn to turn the dial. Anyone can learn to tune into frequencies that the system would prefer to be silenced. Those parts of DNA that do not directly produce proteins have a designation in modern science. It is called junk DNA. For decades, that genetic material was judged merely as evolutionary residue lacking function. But now recent research suggests that this junk is not something thrown in the trash. It is sedimentary matter. It is potential waiting to be activated. And what activates that potential? Consciousness, intention, elevated emotional states, deep meditative practices, sincere connection with another awakened being. Spiritual traditions around the world have described this for millennia in different languages. The awakening of Kundalini in Hinduism, the activation of the Merkaba in Kabbalah, Buddhist enlightenment, the Gnostic Pneuma. However, it is important to realize that these words, in their deepest roots, converge on the same message: the reactivation of aptitudes that had never been used, repressed, numbed, silenced by a procedure that was perpetuated for generations. This does not mean they can be trapped and held forever. This is because the genetic lottery is not the final arbiter of your spiritual destiny. Your day-to-day choices matter more than your DNA. That is to say, your commitment to consciousness is more important than any biological marker, and it is, at the same time, the most liberating and overwhelming news you could have received, because it removes any excuse for passivity. Just think about what it would be like if living from truth were the norm instead of fear. We are not talking about a dramatic, impossible change. These are ordinary decisions made over time that substantially change the direction of an existence. Trusting your intuition when it speaks, even if you have no rational reasons for it. Asking questions that make you uncomfortable instead of accepting answers that numb you. Cultivating relationships based on authentic connection instead of social obligation or convenience. Seeking a job that resonates with what you believe to be true and not just what pays the bills. Questioning authorities you do not trust instead of yielding to them out of habit. These are not heroic, extraordinary choices, and in reality, if you open your eyes, they are the most natural choices a person can make. What is extraordinary, what needs constant pressure and complex maintenance systems, is the opposite. It is living a small life, enduring limits we never agreed to, being part of systems that deep down we know do not serve us. It is an efficient machine of control, but it is not omnipotent. It does not have the right to force anyone into anything. It has the capacity to turn choices into impossible alternatives. Anything that makes the consequences of waking up seem unbearable, but they are illusions that are maintained as long as you feed them. There is a truth that permeates all wisdom traditions. The prisoner who knows he is imprisoned can always escape. The prisoner who does not know he is imprisoned will never try to do so. The first stage in any liberation process is seeing the bars, knowing the mechanisms of your own prison. And it is clear that once you see, you cannot unsee. What the Archons fear more than a blood bank, more than a genetic line, more than a single agent with extraordinary abilities. They fear humans who remember. They remember that they are more than the character they are given to play their role. They know that consciousness is sovereign and cannot be confiscated without consent, and they remember that. They remember the wisdom that crossed generations, encoded in myths, in rites, in traditions dismissed as primitive superstitions, which contain truths that science is still unveiling. May they remember that blood, any blood, is sacred, not because it supposedly belongs to a special line or is part of a chosen group, but because it is the carrier of a consciousness that, in the deepest recesses of its being, is free. In this era, in which everything wants to sequence your DNA, monitor your organism, edit your genetics, and fit it into artificial systems of control, merely celebrating the sacredness of your own existence ends up being an act of resistance. Not a violent and aggressive resistance, but a silent, underground, and completely irreversible struggle. The chosen ones are not chosen for the blood type they carry. They are selected because they choose. They choose truth over comfort. They choose freedom instead of security. They choose to question, not to accept. They decide to wake up instead of falling asleep. And that decision is within your reach now, not tomorrow. Not after reading one more book or watching one more video. Now, in this exact instant, as these words vibrate in something you already knew even before you started watching, ask yourself the questions you have been avoiding. What are you accepting without questioning? Where are you compromising your integrity for security or social acceptance? What would you do if you were not afraid? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are the beginning of true awakening. Humanity is at a turning point. There are so many people waking up every day, so many people stopping playing the game, so many people building alternatives, speaking truths that cost them something, and saying, we cannot cooperate with systems that do not serve the collective good. This will become stronger and stronger, and everyone who wakes up becomes a catalyst for the awakening of others. Your role in this is simple, but profound. Be true. Have the courage to question. Have compassion for those who are still sleeping, because you remember what it is like to be unconscious, and be tireless in your search for the truth. If this video shook something inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Algorithms do not prioritize this type of content. Platforms that make money from maintaining the collective sleep have no interest in amplifying it. So you have to be the vector of transmission. Be the one who plants the seed. If this story has changed the way you perceive the mysteries hidden in your own veins, subscribe and like our channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. It is time to sow the future. The next treasure of knowledge will open very soon.